Thanks a lot for joining us. I'm going to come to your report in just a while, but you travel all over the world and you're now right now in India. The Modi government is just going to finish 6 months in office. There was a lot of euphoria when they got elected. They've been elected on the development plank. From how you read it, and you have the pleasure of reading it far more objectively than some of us can here in India, are they on track on their poll promise? Are they on track to boost economic recovery?
You know, I would say from an international perspective, I think it's very positive. You know, I think the reform agenda that has been announced, early days, but it's encouraging. I think that's one of the reasons you see the markets doing as well here in India as other parts of the world at this point in time. So I think it's off to a really good start. You know, I think the reach out that this government has had to a number of key players around the world, whether it's Japan, the United States, et cetera, has all been very, very well received from that perspective. Quite frankly, last week with the recent trade agreement being resolved between the United States and India, very, very, very positive. I think that's been a great sign that this government is willing to move forward in a very, very positive way. So early days, very encouraging, a lot to do, obviously. This upcoming budget is going to be critical, and you know, I think people are going to be looking for real signs of the reform agenda being implemented.
I'm going to pick your brains a little more on the budget in just a while from now, but there was a lot of euphoria that investors had, and you're right in pointing out that capital markets have been on a bounce because of that. Given that initial euphoria, there's also some noise now beginning to gain momentum that things are not really changing on the ground. You've got to give the government its due that it takes a while. It takes 2, 3, even 4 quarters sometimes. By when do you see action begin to pick up on the ground? By when do you see money break on the ground?
Well, it's early days. I mean, I think the way you phrased it is the right way to look at it, which is, you know, one is you want to understand, you know, from the highest levels of government that these are the policies, these are the reforms that are going to be put in place. I think this government has done a very good job at that.
That's right.
I think now it's the age-old issue, right? The devil's in the detail, and you know, investors are going to be looking for, you know, real concrete examples of reform. For example, what was done in the insurance sector. A very positive message about opening up that particular sector. More of those types of reforms, I think, will go a long way to continuing to build on the momentum that's really been established here over the last 6 months.
You know, while the government has made some really nice noises and has communicated it also very well to the people at large, to the investor community about what it intends to do, there is a lot of concern on whether or not the government can actually bite the bullet, whether or not the government can actually go the whole hog as far as legislative reforms are concerned, that the ones that require the approval of Parliament, because there is an opposition and the government is in a minority in the upper house. Are investors concerned about the fact that reforms that require legislative approvals, insurance for one, may be delayed or may actually not see light of day?
Well, I think that's always the risk factor here, right? Which is, it's one thing to have a positive pro-business, pro-investment, you know, agenda. It's another thing to actually get the reforms, you know, accomplished, to your point. Early days, 6 months, you know, you're not looking for massive changes, but you're looking for really positive messages, positive results that will demonstrate, you know, the real ability to accomplish the reform agenda.
While these reforms carry on, while the government tries to unclog the system, we are a very growth-obsessed nation. Everybody likes to talk about growth to the last decimal point. Where do you see India's growth trend at? And over the course of this government's tenure in the next 5 years, do you believe, are we being too ambitious when we say we could perhaps get a double-digit growth? Could that be a possibility?
Well, it's most definitely a possibility. I think when you look at the details that are contained in our report, you know, we're saying 9% growth. 9% growth is really necessary over the next 20 years to allow India to really reach its potential. We think it's definitely doable. But again, it gets back to the earlier discussion we were just having, which is it requires reform, not only from a government standpoint, but also from a private sector perspective, both working together to really drive this agenda on a go-forward basis.
Your report talks about 9% average rate of growth over the next 20 years to get to the U.S. economy of $10 trillion. Isn't that too ambitious a number that you've put out there, or do you believe the higher the benchmark, the harder the hard work will be?
Well, some would say it's ambitious. We don't think so. When we look at what has to happen in terms of job creation during the next those next 20 years, significant number of jobs that need to be created in order to have this economy realize the potential, in order for people to realize their ambitions. And so, you almost have to back into this to say, if we are to achieve that type of success, it's going to require that type of growth over a period of 20 years, which means, as you point out, that's the average. So in periods where it's less than 9%, it's going to have to be greater than 9% in order to make up on that average over the 20-year period.
Commodity prices over the world have eased. Food prices in India are lower. Inflation is beginning to get into that comfort zone. First few green shoots of recovery are being seen. Are we too smug to believe India is in a sweet spot?
Look, I think you've got some really positive stars lining up here. When you think about oil, price per barrel, who would have ever thought it would have been at this level just 2 years ago? And so, you do have a number of factors that are really, really positive for this economy, and hopefully, will be, providing an adequate foundation for this economy to really take off. So I'd rather have, the tailwinds behind me versus headwinds, and right now you've got tailwinds.
Time for a short break here on the show. We come back and discuss the monetary policy stance and how the world is really preparing as far as U.S. interest rates are concerned. Welcome back. We're in conversation with Dennis Nally of the PwC. If I may just turn focus and talk to you about monetary policy, because we're also a nation that seems to be obsessed with the debate whether rates should go down or should not go down. We don't leave it to Raghuram Rajan alone. We discuss it all the time. And so my question is that because inflation is now in a comfort zone, the finance minister has very openly said that a rate cut will spur growth. It will boost economic activity. The RBI still chooses to be a lot more hawkish than policymakers here in New Delhi. Which side of the debate would you want to throw your weight behind?
Well, I think it gets back to the economic policies you want to put in place here. I think without question, rate reductions can really be a positive for, investment and encouraging investment. I'd say more importantly, what investors are looking for is some clear indication about what's going to happen with rates over a period of time. And so whether you're for the rate cut or not, I think the stability and how you think about that question for the longer term is going to be really essential for giving the confidence that the investors are really looking for the longer term.
I request you to not be diplomatic and give me a very clear answer here. Is the time right and ripe for interest rates to soften in India?
Look, I think that ought to be a part of the equation to be looked at. I think you're absolutely right about inflation and with what's happening. I think in terms of other aspects of the economy that are a big part of that question, and that ought to be, as we all know, one tool in the toolkit to really be used to really spur the type of investment I think that this economy has the potential to really absorb.
You mentioned capital markets, and you did say that there is plenty of euphoria there, and the sentiment which is beginning to look up is perhaps being reflected in capital markets. Some skeptics believe that capital markets always race ahead of reality. Is the euphoria in capital markets really reflective of the macroeconomic fundamentals as we talk?
There's a little bit of that, without question. But another way to look at it is I think maybe the markets have been, sitting on the sidelines, so to speak, looking at the tremendous potential that this economy has and being somewhat frustrated by the inability to, achieve its potential. I think with the new government pro-reform agenda that's been articulated, I think it's given markets, a much different way to look at what that potential is and the realization of that potential.
Right.
So it's early days. Markets, do have a tendency to react. In this case, it's positive, and of course, it's going to be totally dependent upon the reform agenda really, continue to be executed.
You know, India is perhaps one of the very few emerging markets that are poised for an interest rate cut eventually. I'm not saying the December policy, but 12 months now, India is perhaps the only market that will see a policy rate cut happen. How does that really figure things as far as global liquidity is concerned? Does that, are we poised to attract far more inflows?
Well, I think so. I mean, particularly when you take the U.S. market, for example, where you're talking about a rate increase, right?
That's right, yes.
And I think the only real question is not whether you're going to have a rate increase, it's going to be when. And so, you know, when you think about that as a way to attract, you know, more foreign direct investment, that ought to be very positive, right? But I think when you look at the other, you know, large developing markets, I think it's also important to take into context that those economies are at different stages on the journey, right? When you look at a Brazil, you look at a Russia, even look at China, for example.
That's right.
And therefore, you know, where you used to see the BRICS all move in one direction, they were all positive, pro-growth, you're all talking about 7, 8, 9%. You know, today you're seeing much more volatility in those economies.
That's right.
And I do think India is well positioned, you know, with the types of things that we've been talking about here today to really achieve its potential, though.
You know, while we are talking about India's potential, while we're talking about India's poised for better days ahead, there is a lingering concern around the Indian currency. The inflows have been rather robust. The macros are beginning to turn around. But there is relentless weakness in the rupee. What would you attribute that to? Well,
you know, I think it gets back to, you know, the past view about what's really happening in this economy, whether you want to call it, you know, unmet potential is the best way I can describe it. And so I think that does create a lot of volatility from a foreign exchange standpoint. I think consistency of policy, consistency of what the government is looking to achieve, you know, will provide the type of, hopefully, stability in the currency that, you know, has not been achieved thus far anyways.
Away from the rupee, if I may take a quick question on the banking system. Across the world, we've seen that global economic pain always gets reflected on the balance sheets of banks across the world. Banks have been too big to fail, but they have failed, dragged the economy down with them. India is seeing the first few signs of really acute stress in its banking system. Do you believe the government should be losing a lot of sleep over that? And are you one of those people who believes that privatization or lesser government equity in state-owned lenders is perhaps the way forward?
No, I actually think it's both. I really do. I think you know, again, getting back to some of the comments that we made in our report, you know, when you look at the banking sector in particular, I think you do need good government and private sector collaboration, if you will. Interesting debate about how to achieve that, but when you think about you know, alignment of objectives, we think that's absolutely critical. India, to its credit, has been able to weather the financial crisis that we all know about. I think that's because of really good, strong financial regulation and clarity of that regulation. So I wouldn't move off of that, but I think there's a spirit of collaboration that needs to take place between the private sector and the government in order to achieve and continue that progress.
So you don't believe that reducing government equity in public sector banks is perhaps the answer to?
I don't think it's the answer. I really don't. And I think it's a part of a model that you know is will hopefully you know continue to allow India to be successful.
If I return focus and talk to you now about the second generation reforms that the finance minister believes will be all a part of the big budget that the world awaits, this government's full first year budget, so to say. What are the reforms that you, from the position that you see things, would want to see? What are the kind of reforms that will enthuse global investors, get them excited about India?
Well, you know, it's we could probably spend hours on this particular topic, but you know, I think any type of reform that really begins to provide clarity, provide consistency, rule of law, if you will, in terms of how things are going to be dealt with on a go-forward basis. Those are the types of things that I believe you know, many are going to be looking for. You know, big issue around ease of doing business. You know, how competitive is India vis-a-vis other economies in the world? So reforms that make it easier to do business here in India certainly would be something that I think the international community would be looking for. The opening up of other industry sectors. We talked about insurance a second ago. Those would all be indicators that the types of things that are being envisioned here are actually now being proposed to be implemented. I think those would be the types of things we'd be looking for
in the budget. The government has also had a very ambitious divestment program that hasn't really taken off. A lot of it is being pushed to the last quarter. Is that a wise move? Does the government not risk crowding capital markets with too much of government paper all in the last 3 months alone?
Well, I'm not an expert on that subject, so, but I think it does get back to maybe the overarching principle here, which is the markets look for consistency, they look for no surprises, they look for continuity, in terms of, how monetary and fiscal policies really are carried out. And the more that any government, not just India, any government can do to provide that type of surety to the financial markets, it's got to be good.
I have a last question to ask of you, and this really caught my eye when I was going through a report. Your report talks about how every stakeholder in the Indian economy needs to play its part, and so do the corporates. And one of the things that you put the onus on corporate India for is integrity. The 3 years that India did see very high levels of growth, almost 10%, we also saw it being saddled with multi-billion dollars worth of scams. In your view, and because you've got global experience, is high corruption a price we pay for high growth, or is there escaping that?
It's a very interesting question. I start off with a view coming out of the financial crisis. I think the whole issue of trust around the world is at an all-time low, whether it's trust in business, whether it's trust in governments, trust in every institution that you can imagine. And so when we think about it from a business perspective, we think business, we think at PwC, we have an important role to play in helping rebuild that trust. And so whether you think about our role, our responsibility to society, for example, it's not just about delivering short-term profitability. It's about how you build a vibrant, sustainable environment. And so I think if we begin to think about it in that context, we can begin to really deal with some of the issues that you're alluding to. Again, I would say when you think about the business environment and the business environment you want to create here, the way to benchmark that is to look at best-in-class environments all around the world. People want to understand what the rules are. They want to know how to play by those rules and the consistency of application around that. And I think the more business can do to support that, as well as governments can do to support that, will go a long way to beginning to address some of these fundamental issues.
But what we've seen in India is that if rules get flouted and if companies and corporates get pulled up for this does vitiate investor sentiment to a great extent. How should the government then balance out the two? Keep investors enthusiastic, keep investors informed, and still crack down on some of the malpractices that one does see while business is being done?
Well, you're seeing other parts of the world do exactly that, which is, investors want to have the confidence that, there's a level playing field out there, right? And without that, that capital, that investment is going to go elsewhere. And so I think government has a role to play. I think the business community has a role to play as well.
My last question to you has to be on Europe. While the world seems to be recovering, getting out of the woods, Europe has once again thrown a challenge, thrown a threat of pulling the global economy down. Are you losing sleep over how fragile Europe is right now?
Look, I think it's one of the hot spots in the world today. I'm a big fan of saying you can't save your way to prosperity. And I think, certain of the economies in Europe are seeing that. They're seeing that without a willingness to create a pro-investment environment, they're going to continue to struggle from an economic recovery standpoint. So it's interesting, you're now starting to see some of the fiscal policies, monetary policies that were used elsewhere in the world begin to get introduced in the European economic environment. Unfortunately, I think it's going to take a while for that to happen. Nonetheless, what you hope for is, to your point, that there isn't some big surprise out there that has the cascading effect to the rest of the world from an economic recovery standpoint. That's what we're all hoping for.
What China did over the weekend, and I'm so tempted to ask you because I missed this question, what China did over the weekend, the People's Bank of China cutting interest rates, it took the world by surprise, but it is being done to spur demand, to spur economic growth, which is at what, a quarter of a century low. Are we going to see more loose monetary policy by markets like these, a Bank of Japan, a China doing stuff like this?
Well, I think, central banks are using many of the tools that they have available to them to spur growth, to spur investment. And what you saw coming out from China is exactly designed to do that. And I think it's an acknowledgement that that economy is in fact slowing, and therefore, one of the things that they can actually do is to, make the interest rate environment much more attractive to spur that kind of demand.
And the world is betting on when will U.S. interest rates begin to rise. How are you betting on this one?
If I were a successful forecaster, I would not be in this business that I'm in today. So the only thing I know is interest rates will rise sometime.
Thanks very much
Great.
for talking to us.
Thanks.
Pleasure.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/etnow.